Fala galera, tudo bem com vocês? Eu me chamo Patrick e vocês estão no canal Ar News. E no vídeo de hoje um conteúdo muito legal a respeito da Primeira Guerra Mundial. Para ser mais específico, a atuação do Brasil durante esse conflito. Talvez alguns de vocês se perguntem o que o Brasil fazia durante esse conflito, durante a Primeira Guerra Mundial. Pois é, não se fala muito a respeito disso. Geralmente quando fala de Brasil na guerra, se fala muito da Segunda Guerra Mundial, com os pracinhas, conflito na Itália contra os alemães, enfim. Mas nesse vídeo vocês verão um conteúdo muito legal, bem aprofundado, de altíssima qualidade, produzido por um canal que é especializado na Primeira e Segunda Guerra Mundial. Então, assim, os caras sabem o que estão falando, tá bom? E é claro, se você curte esse tipo de conteúdo, se inscreve no canal, deixa o like e ativa o sininho das notificações para não perder os próximos vídeos. Mas agora chega de conversa e vamos pro vídeo.
We've done a series of specials about various countries during the First World War, and this is another of them. Although today it features a country that joined late in the war and was quite far from most of the action: Brazil. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about Brazil during the First World War. Brazil declared its neutrality on August 4th, 1914, right after the war broke out. Politically, this was no problem for the first couple of years. Relations between Brazil and Germany became strained, though, once Germany reinstituted unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917. This meant that now any ship of any nation within the war zone was a target and could be fired on without warning. On April 5th, the steamship Piranha, loaded with coffee, was torpedoed near France and 3 Brazilians were killed. This provoked an outcry and demonstrations around Brazil, and properties belonging to Germans or people of German descent were vandalized in Porto Alegre. The Brazilian foreign minister, Lauro Müller, was of German descent and would soon be forced to resign by anti-German sentiment. Brazil broke off diplomatic relations with Germany April 11th. On May 20th, the Tijuca was sunk by a German sub, and on the 26th, the Lapa was as well. The Brazilian government then, over the next few months, seized 42 German ships that were in Brazilian ports. These became a quarter of the Brazilian fleet. By October, and the sinking of the steamship Macau, the cry for war had grown too loud, and on October 26, 1917, Brazil declared war on Germany. There were anti-German riots after this in many cities around Brazil, and when 2 more Brazilian ships were sunk in early November, the government closed German-Brazilian schools and newspapers. Labor unions, communists, and pacifists were against the war, and they thought the government was using the declaration of war to avoid internal issues. There had been a big general strike, for example, after the police killed a young shoemaker that had seen loads of incidents of violence between workers and security forces. They were kind of right about this distraction, since the government declared a state of emergency and arrested some of the political opposition. So Brazil was now at war. And what did they do next? Well, Brazilian ports were open to Allied shipping, and the Brazilian Navy was responsible for patrolling the South Atlantic. Brazil also made a commitment at the Inter-Allied Conference in November to send a medical mission of civilian and military surgeons to combat support hospitals in Europe, and a group of officers and non-coms to serve in the French army. Now, they were to learn the tactics and strategy of modern war on the Western Front that the French had learned by hard experience the past 3 years. In 1918, a study by presidential candidate Rodrigues Alves recommended sending a sizable force to France using every available means, like captured enemy ships, where it would be trained and equipped by the French and financed by bank loans from the U.S. Alves won the election, but died in January 1919 of the Spanish flu before taking office. As for the plan, it failed because of a combination of circumstances, partly political and partly the lack of a clear foreign policy. The medical mission was sent, though, and arrived September 24, 1918. Its main contribution was helping the French deal with the Spanish flu pandemic. The main Brazilian military contribution to the war was naval. In January 1918, the War Operations Naval Division, whose Portuguese name gives the acronym DNOG, was created with units from the Brazilian fleet. Under Rear Admiral Pedro Max Fernando Frontin, it was to be incorporated into the British fleet at Gibraltar and was to patrol the triangle São Vicente, Dakar, and Gibraltar. The war at sea began for Brazil August 1st, 1918, when the DNOG left Rio de Janeiro. 2 days later, one of its ships was torpedoed by the Germans. On the 9th, the DNOG arrived in Sierra Leone, where they would remain for 2 weeks, and at this time, the men began getting sick with the Spanish flu. On the 25th, they went to Dakar, and men dying of the disease began in earnest. They would remain at Dakar for 2 months, though, because by now, the Allies were arguing over what to do with the Brazilian fleet. The Italians wanted them in the Mediterranean. The Americans wanted them in the North Atlantic, and the French wanted them to patrol the Triangle. They finally decided in early November to have the Brazilian fleet in the Mediterranean. Several days later, the war was over. Brazil had a seat at the table at the Paris Peace Conference. The captured German ships became a symbolic payment to Brazil as reparations, and Brazil was a founding member of the League of Nations. During the war, Brazil had managed to change from an economy that was mostly dependent on coffee exports to a more varied commercial one. The country began to industrialize to meet the demand for many raw materials and products. In fact, industrial output quadrupled, and the nation eased its reliance on imports. When Brazil joined the war, its army was not in much of a position to offer any help. The last large-scale conflict it was involved in was the Paraguay War in the 1870s. And though there had been attempts to strengthen it with things like conscription, they had failed. In fact, in some places like Sao Paulo and Rio, the police corps was better equipped and prepared than the National Army. Brazil's strength lay in the Navy. It did feature 2 latest-generation dreadnoughts bought from the U.S., and it was a real naval power in Latin America, but only a medium power on the world stage. Brazil was also in the shadow of the U.S. It had clear interests in promoting itself as a mid-power nation, sure, and a soft player in the geopolitical landscape after the war. But it couldn't, by 1918, yet intervene in a land war in Europe. It could and did, though, intervene at sea as the lone Latin American nation actively at war.
Bom, pessoal, é um conteúdo curtinho, tá? Um videozinho rápido aí pra vocês, porém um conteúdo muito bem feito, que eu não poderia deixar passar, afinal faz parte da nossa história. E eu também convido você a assistir o próximo vídeo, que é sobre o Brasil durante a Segunda Guerra Mundial. Inclusive é o mesmo canal, é o mesmo apresentador, ou seja, é um conteúdo de altíssima qualidade. Aí sim já é um vídeo maior, um pouco mais aprofundado, porque a atuação do Brasil na Segunda Guerra Mundial foi um pouco mais complexa. Então, se você não quiser perder esse vídeo, deixa o like, se inscreve no canal e ativa o sininho das notificações para não perder nenhum conteúdo aqui do canal. Muito obrigado por terem assistido, fiquem todos com Deus e até mais.